Devil's footprints. According to a Wikipedia article I found, back in 1855 in East and South Devon, England, a weird incident took place that left witnesses pretty confused and disturbed. As the story goes, in February of that year, there was a very heavy snowstorm, and the next morning there were more than 30 reports from different locations in England of a seemingly endless single-file trail of hoof-like prints in the snow. Witnesses of the incident allegedly claimed the prints covered over 100 miles of terrain, which, according to Wikipedia, left a lot of people pretty puzzled as to what had caused them. Strangely, the article also mentions that the hoofprints appeared on rooftops, haystacks, and other obstacles that you normally wouldn't expect animals to climb on. As you can imagine, it didn't take long for people to start coming up with wild theories to explain the hoofprints, with many of them claiming they belonged to the devil, I guess because some of the people thought the prints looked like goat prints. Now, obviously there are much more rational theories to explain why these prints could have appeared overnight in so many locations at the same time, and the only reason the Wikipedia article is titled Devil's Footprints in the first place is only because that's the name of the urban legend. And you gotta consider that this theory was probably made up by a bunch of very bored townspeople back in the 1800s. The article actually mentions that there's very little evidence that the incident even happened in the first place, which in itself is pretty strange. According to Wikipedia, there was some sort of article published back in 1950 where the authors asked anyone with information about the mysterious hoofprints to come forward. And even though the article was published almost 100 years after the alleged incident, Wikipedia says it led to a bunch of papers written by an Englishman back in the 1850s being discovered. Those papers included letters to friends where the man apparently mentioned the hoofprints multiple times. Interestingly, in one of the letters, the man admitted that he made up the story about the prints belonging to a bunch of kangaroos that had supposedly escaped from a rich guy's collection of wild animals to keep the people from thinking the prints actually belonged to the devil. Aside from the made-up superstition that the prints had been left by the devil, there are a couple of more logical theories that surfaced in the months following the supposed incident. According to a local guy named Major Carter, the prints hadn't been caused by any animal, but by a balloon that had actually been released from a nearby dockyard with the shackles still attached to the ropes, which would explain why they appeared in single file. Still, skeptics have pointed out how incredibly unlikely it would be for a balloon to travel so far without being stopped by obstacles like trees or houses. Other sources who have researched the incident in depth have clarified that it would have been impossible for the tracks to span anything close to 100 miles, and that this part of the story was probably just made up or greatly exaggerated. According to Wikipedia, the other widely accepted theory for the hoofprints is that it could have just been badgers that, for whatever reason, decided to go hunting that evening, as this is the animal that would leave the most similar prints to the ones that people reported seeing. But even though there's a bunch of reasonable explanations, the fact remains that there isn't any conclusive evidence to prove where these hoofprints came from, and this is probably just one of those niche historical events that's going to remain a mystery forever. Belmez Faces. Belmez is a tiny little village and municipality with less than 3,000 inhabitants in Cordoba, Spain. It's not really known for anything too extraordinary, except for this one occurrence documented on Wikipedia that talks about something pretty strange that happened there back in the 70s. According to the article, on August 23, 1971, a Belmez resident named Maria Camara claimed that a human face with a creepy expression had appeared out of nowhere on her concrete kitchen floor. As per Maria's own testimony, as soon as she saw the face, she was so disturbed, and knowing that she wasn't going to be able to unsee it, she called her husband Juan and their son Miguel, after which they destroyed the face with a pickaxe and laid down new concrete. As the story goes, after the new concrete was placed, a new face appeared on the floor just a few days later. The Wikipedia article mentions that at this point, Maria and her family reported the incident to the mayor of Belmez, who ordered the concrete to be carefully removed to be studied. Doing more research on the story, I found that after they removed the second slab of concrete, a bunch of seriously disturbing faces allegedly started appearing all over the house, and pretty soon Maria's house was being advertised to tourists from all over Spain as the House of the Faces. According to Wikipedia, less than 9 months later, hundreds of tourists from all over the country were traveling to Belmez to catch a glimpse of the faces. And apparently the buzz didn't stop there. For the next 3 decades, Maria and her family continued to allege that disturbing faces were appearing all over their house, sometimes in just a matter of seconds and right in front of their eyes. As you can probably guess, because of the amount of attention the house was getting, the authorities decided to carry out some investigations to determine whether Maria and her family were making it all up, or whether something else was actually taking place at the house. This is where the story starts to get a little strange. Even though several tests were carried out to determine whether or not the faces had been painted on the concrete by hand, the results of a lot of the tests contradicted each other. And to this day, it's still unknown whether or not the faces were painted by Maria and her family. The case even drew the attention of a bunch of paranormal investigators, and a few of them claimed that while they were conducting experiments on the house, they supposedly started hearing voices when there was nobody else in the house, and they allegedly even saw new faces pop out of nowhere on the concrete while they were there. But as it often happens, the authorities accused the investigators of carrying out their experiments without the proper controls and documentation, which took pretty much all the credibility out of what they said they found at the house. To this day, nobody really knows where the faces came from, but the most widely accepted theory is that Maria and her family made the whole thing up pretty convincingly and capitalized on the media frenzy for financial gain. To the skeptics, the media is just as much to blame as Maria for publishing so many sensationalist pieces on the house, which made it incredibly difficult for the authorities to carry out the proper tests and get credible results. List of unexplained sounds. The content in the Wikipedia article named List of Unexplained Sounds is just as strange as the title suggests. The article is pretty much a list of sounds that have been picked up in remote locations all over the world by the most state-of-the-art hydrophones known to man. For those that don't know, a hydrophone is just an underwater device that detects and records ocean sounds from all directions. As mentioned in the introduction of the article, the sound files had to be sped up to 16 times the original speed, and their frequency was also raised to make them audible. What's so interesting about these sounds is that nobody knows what's causing them, which is kind of disturbing considering they're all coming from remote locations like the bottom of the ocean and far beneath the Earth's surface. For example, one of the unidentified sounds is called upsweep, and it was picked up by the US Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration using its Pacific Ocean Hydrophone Array. As the article mentions, the sound was first discovered when the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory began recording with their hydrophone array somewhere in the ocean between New Zealand and South America. If you listen to the sound, which I'll play here in a second, you'll realize why it's called upsweep, as it comes across as a series of sound waves that go from low to high frequency. The Wikipedia article mentions that the sound appears to come and go depending on the season of the year, with the volume reaching its peak in spring and autumn. This is what it sounds like. As of today, scientists have no idea what this is, or where the sound even comes from, though a few have suggested that upsweep might be caused by underwater volcanic activity. Interestingly, the volume of upsweep has been steadily declining since it was first recorded in 1991, another crazy thing scientists can't explain. This sound, and some of the other sounds in the article themselves, are honestly nothing out of the ordinary, but the fact that not even the top researchers in the field have a single clue as to what's causing them is a little disturbing when you really think about it. The Anguished Man. There's a Wikipedia article out there titled The Anguished Man, which tells the story of a visually disturbing painting of the same name that's owned by a man from Cumbria, England named Sean Robinson. According to the article, Sean claims the painting fell into the ownership of his grandmother at some point in the distant past, and when she passed away, she allegedly gave it to him. However, as the Wikipedia article explains, the owner insists that this is no ordinary painting, as his grandmother supposedly told him that the artist had mixed his own blood with the paint to make the artwork before taking his life. The story is kind of vague, and I couldn't really find any more information on who the supposed artist was or when the Anguished Man was even painted, which makes the whole thing pretty hard to believe. I did some more research and found other sources where Sean claims his grandmother hid the painting in her attic for over 25 years. As the story goes, before giving it to Sean, she mentioned that she had supposedly experienced paranormal activity at her house, with the dark figure of a man suddenly appearing at random times of the night, accompanied by the sounds of screaming, moaning, and crying. The Wikipedia article also links to Sean's YouTube named The Anguished Man, in which he explains that after inheriting the painting, he and his family allegedly also started experiencing paranormal activity at their house, with the supposed dark figure appearing to them as well in the middle of the night. Sean claims that before inheriting the painting, he was a total skeptic. But after bringing it home, he allegedly started hearing crying noises that got louder and louder every night until eventually he could no longer deny the supposed paranormal activity taking place at his house. Over the years, the painting has caught the attention of several so-called paranormal investigators. Sean's YouTube channel, where he documents the supposed evil activity, has since grown to 20,000 subscribers. In 2017, an independent filmmaker was even planning on making a movie on it and had bought the rights from Sean, but from what I could find, it was either never released or it just wasn't very popular. Overall, I see a lot of red flags that make it pretty clear that the story behind the anguished man is fake. For starters, the videos on Sean's YouTube channel where he uploads allegedly real footage of the paranormal activity at his house are all very clearly fabricated. Also, the story behind the painting itself is just so vague and far-fetched that I find it hard to believe it even has a grain of truth to it. I'm more inclined to agree with all the people who have accused Sean of making the artwork with regular paint himself and using the grandmother's story as a cop-out so he wouldn't have to provide more details about the alleged artist. Overall, the anguished man definitely makes for a good scary story, but I find no real reason to think that this is anything other than a creative hoax designed to get attention and maybe a couple of bucks out of a made-up story. Poe Toaster. On October 7, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe died in Baltimore under pretty mysterious circumstances. According to a Wikipedia article, starting sometime in the 1930s, every morning on the anniversary of Poe's birthday, a man dressed in black carrying a silver-tipped cane with his face almost fully covered by a scarf or hood would somehow sneak into the Westminster Hall and Burying Ground in Baltimore and find his way to Poe's grave. The article mentions the man would then pour himself a glass of Martell cognac and raise a toast in Poe's honor, after which he would arrange 3 red roses on the gravestone next to his unfinished bottle of cognac and leave. Interestingly, the Poe Toaster, as he became to be known in Baltimore, never sought publicity and would always sneak into the burying ground unnoticed. Every year after his first appearance, a crowd of onlookers would start to gather on the morning of Poe's birthday to try to catch a glimpse of the man, but he was rarely seen or photographed. In fact, the only photograph I found of him is from a Life magazine July 1990 article called Once Upon a Midnight Dreary, written by Gary Smith. The photograph was captured by Bill Ballenberg, and it shows the Poe Toaster hunched over the gravestone paying his respects to Edgar Allan Poe. Interestingly, the Poe Toaster would sometimes also leave cryptic notes on the gravestone during his visits. For example, in 1993, he left a note saying that the torch would soon be passed, and another one that said, "Edgar, I haven't forgotten you." As it happened, the Poe Toaster was reported to have passed away in 1998 because he was no longer seen visiting the grave. But after which, the article mentions the tradition of visiting the grave and toasting in Poe's honor was passed on to one of his sons. Unfortunately, it looks like whoever inherited the tradition didn't take it half as seriously as his father, as the post-1998 Poe Toaster would often leave notes commenting on sports teams and politics, which his father had never done. At some point between 2005 and 2008, he left a note that was apparently so disappointing that the curator of the Poe House and Museum didn't even show it to the public to protect the original Poe Toaster's honor and legacy, a man whose identity is still unknown to this day. But because this was such a big tradition in Baltimore for 70 years, in 2015 the city organized a competition to select a new Poe Toaster to turn the tradition into more of a tourist-friendly yearly attraction. Since 2016, the new anonymous Poe Toaster has kept up the tradition by visiting Edgar Allan Poe's grave on his birthday and paying his respects in front of the public. Mystery of Celtic Wood. There's an article on Wikipedia that talks about the mystery of Celtic Wood, a strange incident that took place back in October 1917. According to the article, during the Battle of Poelcapelle in West Flanders in World War I, the 10th Battalion of the 1st Australian Division decided to capture Passchendaele Ridge to collapse the German 4th Army. The plan was to raid Celtic Wood, blow up the German dugouts, and then immediately retreat back to safety. Unfortunately, things didn't go exactly as planned, leading to one of the biggest wartime mysteries in history. The article mentions that a little after 5 a.m. on October 9, 7 officers and 78 men of the 10th Battalion began their raid on Celtic Wood, and that's the last time many of them were ever seen. Whatever happened in those woods depends on who you ask, but the general consensus is that the attack was a complete failure. According to the British and Australian wartime newspapers, the attack was considered a victory, but 10th Battalion Commander Maurice Wilder Nelligan, who was there when the whole thing happened, had a completely different take on the events. According to Wikipedia, the commander mentioned that the attack immediately turned into a very violent bloodbath, and that after the raid on Celtic Wood, only 14 unwounded members of the battalion made it back safely. This is where things get a little confusing, as other members of the battalion said only 7 men made it back to the Australian lines. Strangely, the article mentions that official army records were able to account for 37 of the 85 battalion members. Even more mysteriously, after the raid, the bodies of the missing battalion soldiers were never found. Their names didn't even show up on lists of prisoners of war, and the Graves Commission couldn't find any traces of their bodies afterward, which is extremely strange. Different sources have different reports of how many people actually went missing, but it's widely accepted that the true figure is at least 37. For almost 100 years, the raid of Celtic Wood remained a mystery, with most experts agreeing that the Germans probably massacred the missing men and buried them in a mass grave. However, Wikipedia mentions that in 2008, researchers Chris Henschke and Robert Kearney claimed to have conclusive evidence that the members of the 10th Battalion had been killed by the Germans in the woods, and that the only reason they couldn't find traces of their bodies was that they had been blown up with their own bombs. When mixed with the remains of the dead German soldiers, this made it impossible to tell Australian soldiers from German soldiers after the fact. In Henschke's own words, the raid wasn't a great mystery, it was the story of a typical small unit action that went wrong. However, not every expert agrees with this conclusion, and to this day, the raid of Celtic Wood remains one of the biggest, strangest World War I mysteries.